Evening, everyone. Nice to have you back this evening. Given a moment for folks to trickle in. We are pleased to be sort of transitioning to a new disciplinary perspective this week. So the last 3 weeks, we've heard from scientists and medical professionals, and this week we are shifting to a humanities perspective.
Yeah, we're very excited to be joined by Dr. Brenda Llewellyn-Eisen, who will be speaking today on two perspectives from the history of religion. It's called Christian Responses to Plagues in Public Health. Two perspectives from the history of religion. Dr. Brenda Llewellyn-Eisen is Associate Professor of Early and Medieval Christian History at PLU and is also a member of PLU's Department of Religion. Brenda looks so forward to your guiding us through both of these very fascinating texts. I really enjoyed them, which in so many ways speak to our current condition. So Brenda, you have the word. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I would like to start by first thanking Teresa and Tamara for inviting me to be a part of this conversation. I was very excited to have the opportunity to apply to be part of it and to be accepted. That was exciting too. So let's get started. I understand that we are now doing something for something completely different as our Monty Python Flying Circus direction now for something completely different. We're going to look at responses to plague from different disciplinary perspectives, but ones that do not stand really in any tension with scientific approaches to viruses, to plagues, and to healthcare. So let's get started. I made a little outline for you, as you know, from the handout that I posted on the website. So just to give you a brief outline of what I'm going to do in case you didn't have a chance to look at that earlier. The first thing I want to do is to spend some time with the disciplines and give you a really good grounding in what religious history, how it functions, the kinds of questions that religious historians ask of texts. Also to just introduce you to medical or health humanities. I'm really just kind of flirting with the discipline. I have not received professional training in medical and health humanities, but I do work in many ways with a lot of my texts from the using the perspectives of medical and health humanities, and I'll give you more insight into that when we get to that part. The second part of my talk is going to address medicine in late antiquity, because that's going to ground you in the types of medical care that was available to people during the times of the texts that were written. We'll talk a little bit about methods of distribution and what that looked like for patients. The third part of our time today is the context and the perspectives of the two authors, John of Ephesus and his name just went out of my head. Cyprian of Carthage. The plague is named after him, Cyprian of Carthage, and his name is right there. And then the fourth part of our talk is questions and strategies that the authors raise. I gave you in advance some questions and things to consider, and you'll have time to discuss those with me and each other. And then the fifth part is, of course, some concluding thoughts and opportunity for Q&A. So let's go ahead and get started. So the first thing, the disciplines. Let's talk about religious history. Pre-Enlightenment, it was believed that the purpose of history was to serve theology. So in other words, history was not a discipline that was understood as apart from theology, but was rather to support the theology of whatever religion it was representing. So it wasn't its own separate discipline. And the job of any historian who was writing from the perspective of a religion or about a religion was to show the rightness of that particular religious belief, okay? So the changes that came about in the university system after the Enlightenment really changed the discipline of history, and then aided in creating religious history as its own discipline. In addition to the changes in the university system, arrival of wonderful theories and methods such as womanist theory, feminist theory, gender studies, queer theory, and also very distinctive disciplines such as environmental studies or sociology started asking questions about religion that allowed us to think about religion in a different way, okay? So post-Enlightenment within a university setting, history, as it pertained to religion, became really its own discipline, independent of theological claims of any particular religious group. Okay, so these exciting changes in the field meant a lot of new questions were being asked. And of course, as student bodies have changed in the past 100, 200 years, and by student body, I mean who's studying religion and what they're bringing to the table, this has really changed the field. So post-Enlightenment ways of studying religion wasn't, what changed wasn't just religious history, but also the field overall. So the most common way that people study religion is to study religious groups. So Christianity 101 or Islam 101 is usually an introductory way into studying religion. So groups of people, groups of religious persons in very, very general terms. Nothing wrong with that if you're taking 101, but it gets more specific from there. A second and very popular way of studying religion is through texts. And texts can mean sacred scriptures of particular groups like the Quran or the Hebrew Bible, or the Avestas, right? Scriptures are texts, particular texts that groups hold dear that reflect their beliefs and their ethics and their rituals and sometimes their histories or what they understand as their histories. So studying religion through a particular religious group's text is one way to study religion. Another way is through their theologies, and very often their theologies are embedded in their texts, but not always. Theologies, meaning logos and theo, so words or ideas about things that are divine, are usually texts that reveal the religious fidelity of a particular group. Okay, so their belief systems, their belief structures, and those belief systems can pertain to the way they live during their lifetime, or it can pertain to a life lived beyond this particular lifetime, okay? Another way of studying religion post-Enlightenment is through ritual. And this is where disciplines like anthropology and sociology really excel and help scholars of religious history understand better the texts that we read. Because rituals and behaviors can teach us so much about what we believe true. A second to last way of studying religion in the post-Enlightenment world is through ethics. And ethics are very, short explanation of what ethics are, demonstrations of people's belief systems, okay, through their behaviors. And these are codes that help guide people through the course of their lifetime, often codes that accompany them from birth to death. And then finally, of course, there's my field, not last but not least kind of field, but I wanted to end there, not start there. And that's histories, okay? Ways to study religion are through religious people's histories. And the histories can be embedded in the texts, they can be embedded in the theologies, or they can be texts that are completely independent of sacred scriptures. And so because you can find history embedded in ritual, you can find history embedded in theology, and you can find history embedded in text, you have to ask a lot of questions about the text or the ritual or the theology or the artifact that presents itself as history. Okay, so whatever the artifact is, that's going to be our primary source. In our case, our primary source is a text, so that makes it a little bit easier. And it's a text It's been translated into English for you, so that makes it even easier. But irrespective of the language and irrespective of the type of evidence, we have to do things with that source as historians. And so I'm gonna put a big chart up, but I don't want anyone to panic thinking they need to write it down because it's on your handout. And we're just really gonna gloss over it here really quickly. So what do you do with the primary source, right? What do you do with the evidence of history? You have to ask questions, and those questions have to be layered in complexity. We start usually with contextualizing, and contextualizing means rooting the evidence or the text in its time period. Because if you read something, for example, from the New Testament Gospel of Mark, for example, and it doesn't make sense to you, you can be assured that it probably made pretty clear sense to somebody 2,000 years ago because their context is different than yours. So if you don't understand it, it's not that you're stupid and that's why you don't understand it. It's just that their experience is not your experience, right? So you have to learn something of who created the text, if you can, what you can know about the author, the type of text that it is, right? Is it literature? Is it a poem? Is it a receipt for payment of something? Is it a building, right? So again, it doesn't always have to just be a text. Is it a law, right? And if it's a law, is it a secular law? Is it a governmental law, or is it a religious law? Okay, so all of these different things about the piece of evidence. The second thing you have to do to answer at least some of those questions is you have to evaluate the evidence of history. And so evaluation is a different kind of set of questions. So you have to ask what kinds of assumptions or biases the author might have and how that might impact what they're writing. Or key words and phrases. And sometimes you can focus on a single word, and that single word can teach you so much about what's going on more broadly in the text. And then that can teach you something about what mattered to people at that time, and that's doing history. And then finally, the last level of working with a primary source is the level of analysis. And here's where you have to ask questions about what's not there. So for example, what gaps do you have? What questions are not answered? And I'm going to give you an example from what we worked with today in my early Christianity class. So here we are in week 4, and my students read for this week a text called the Infancy Gospel of Thomas, which is not a text that's in the New Testament, which is fine. I don't teach the New Testament. But a lot of my students know the New Testament, and this Infancy Gospel of Thomas is about Jesus as a brat, and he kills people and brings them back to life, and he's a really nasty little kid. And it's about age 6 to 12 in this gospel. And my students say, why isn't this in the gospel? Why don't we read about this important history in the gospels? And I said, well, first of all, it's not history. It's a story, right? It's just a story meant to, answer a different set of questions than the types of gospels that you have in the canon. But second, it allows us to say, but wait a second, this type of narrative isn't in the Gospels. So what does that tell us about the Gospels? What does that tell us about what mattered to them? Okay. So sometimes gaps can give you insight is my point. Okay. In terms of analysis, the most important thing that you can do though is engage in a kind of a meta reflection that may or may not show up in your paper. Right? And that is this: asking, how does my privilege or lack of privilege or race or gender identity status or situation vis-a-vis colonial and post-colonial history shape what I am reading and how I am analyzing this text? So in addition to asking all of the kinds of questions about the author, about the audience, about the source, about the date of the source, in addition to asking all of those kinds of contextual questions, really good student of history is going to ask those kinds of questions about themselves as well, so that they can keep from making the text about themselves. And that's an important piece. So that leads me to a little lesson that I always give at the beginning of every history course, which is my encouraging comments about how you approach primary sources. And we're going to practice these things too. So it's kind of a pledge that we take. We promise to try to understand people and ideas and practices and institutions on their terms, not on our terms. We don't want to make assumptions that if somebody doesn't have medical knowledge about something, that it's because they're stupid. Oh, they were stupid then. They didn't know about bacteria, right? Well, that's not their world. They didn't have tools that we have, and they also understood some things better than we do. So we have to be mindful that their circumstances reflect their experience, not ours. So we work very hard to not impose assumptions on people living in a different place and time. We recognize that religion is connected to, shaped by, and influences historical context. And then we also try really hard to focus on how an experience of the divine made a difference, rather than on whether somebody experienced something that we want to call divine or not. So in other words, historians are not interested in asking, did this actually happen or not? That's not our job. Our job is to consider the evidence and ask, what is the result of somebody thinking or believing or writing that this thing happened? Okay, I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, this is being recorded. You can go back and play that loop 10 more times, right? And by the 10th time, you'll go, oh, okay, I get it. Or you can ask later in the Q&A. The other discipline, of which I'm only just going to give you a whisper of information, because again, I'm just flirting with it. I am not, this is not my field, right? Is that of health humanities. And we're going to look, one of the questions I gave you takes a health humanities approach to the text. Health humanities is an interdisciplinary field that's emerged in the last 40 years or so, that explores health and illness and healing through creative arts and disciplines of the humanities. So in short, health humanities believes that better health of individuals can be addressed through equal appliance of creative arts and scientific method. And health humanities recognizes that a medical doctor is better informed about their patients if they have a greater understanding of the artistic world, and the artistic world is better informed about their audience if they have a greater understanding of human anatomy and the medical world. Okay, and look at this picture and we'll come back to it near the end. All right, so the next thing I want to do is talk just briefly about what health and disease and illness meant in classical world and late antiquity, which is the time period when our authors are composing their texts. So health, poor health, and good health consisted of a couple of different factors in late antiquity. So illness was a person's experience of sickness or disease. And illness is what a person took to the doctor or to the divine being. If you were feeling some kind of way, this is what you would take this information. I'm feeling very upset in my stomach, or I'm feeling my back is in pain, or I have this odd bruise. That's the thing, right? That illness. This is what you're taking to the doctor. It hurts when I do this kind of thing. Disease is the underlying pathology, all right? And it is what is wrong with your body and why. This is how it's understood in the classical world and antiquity. I'm not defining these things for 21st century. So for example, the disease would be, let's say I have cancer, right? That would be the underlying pathology, and what that does to my body, that would be the illness. And then finally, sickness would be how other people treat me, right? Sickness is how other people think about a person who is ill. And so sickness is reflected in the relationships and the way that they change among people when a person has an illness or a disease that has been identified, okay? So it's helpful to remember that all three of these categories shaped the way a person received care, and it shaped people's attitudes towards someone who had a disease or experienced illness, okay? Now, let's say you're sick and you're not sick you're experiencing illness and you have a disease and you need to have it addressed. In the classical and late antique world, you had a whole medical marketplace from which you could choose. You could approach a physician, a folk healer, a member of your family, or a divine being. You would always start with the family. The family was the first point of focus for any kind of healthcare. Generally the self, right? Yourself, you are the first point person for anything that's wrong. Especially in Roman families, the father, or the paterfamilias, the head of the family, was the individual to whom you had to turn to ask, even if you had permission to seek healthcare. And healthcare at the family level was really basic, right? So the Romans and the Greeks were very much in favor of clean water. You ingest clean water, you bathe regularly in clean water and have clean water in your home. Diet and fasting were common sort of family ways of addressing medical issues. And then of course, supplication and prayers. Every home had a family altar that was ancestral. And so supplications and prayers would be made at the family altar. But if that didn't work and you needed a different kind of medical care, you could go to a physician. And a physician, I want to say two things about physicians in the Greek and Roman world in the classical and late antique period. Physicians were holistic. So they looked at the individual and they asked a series of questions. How old are you? Have you been traveling? What do you eat? What part of town do you live in? Are you an enslaved person or a free person? Because those kinds of questions, they believed, would help them understand what was out of balance in the individual. This is a very holistic approach towards care for the body. The other thing that I would like to say about physicians in the medical marketplace is that they were very much convinced that the natural world would tell us what we need to know if we just looked carefully enough and if we just listened. And when things are out of balance in nature, things are going to be out of balance in the body. So in this time period, the natural world includes both the finite and the infinite, so the secular and the divine. And so if those aspects were out of balance, if you had committed some crime or done something wrong, if the divine beings were displeased with you, that could also impact your health. So in other words, divine discontent could be divine discontent could impose itself upon a person's body and result in ill health. In addition to physicians and the paterfamilias, or the family or self-care, you also have folk healers. And for the sake of the fact that this is we're dealing with two Christian theologians who are dealing with religious responses, I put an image of Jesus in there because it's important to remember that Jesus' career was essentially that of a folk healer. If you look at the activity of Jesus in the New Testament, his primary job is to heal people, which doesn't mean he opens a little black bag and he pulls out, instruments, but he's engaged in the restoration of people and their ill bodies into community, okay, which is a component of healing. So folk healers are individuals who basically engage with people who are known within either their own family, their own community, their own village. They hold generational wisdom, charge for their services, and very often their care for their patients took place usually within their own home, not within a temple or a place where, like one of the schools, maybe where the physicians would be located. And they were a type of professional, but very often marginalized professionals. And then finally, if none of these worked for you, you could, of course, also appeal to divine beings. You could go to a temple, you could go to some of the healing shrines. And we know from the sources that that when disease would strike cities, there was often a rise in religiosity. religious rituals, religious rites, small votives would be written, divinities would be appealed to. And so we see the development of shrines to Asclepius, shrines to, here we have Mars, who's one of the deities of plague, and Asclepius here with his staff, who is just a general all-around healing divinity. And so you could appeal to a divinity to assist you, to heal you or your child or whoever you were appealing on behalf of, or for forgiveness for whatever crime you might have committed, of which you might not even be aware, to try to restore, right, the displeasure that a divinity might be experiencing for you. So what I want to stress here at the end of just this little medical marketplace piece is that very often people were appealing to all of them. Right? It wasn't the case that usually one person would just go to one, right? Not just because, you know, one didn't work, but because it was an open competition and they weren't necessarily in conflict with each other. So a physician would maybe send you to a shrine, and if you went to the shrine, they would say, oh, be sure and consult so-and-so in the next village because she could probably help you if we can't, right? So there was competition, but none of these factors were denying the efficacy of each other. So again, they weren't standing in conflict with each other. So the physicians didn't discount the divinities, and the divinities didn't discount, or those in charge of the divine shrines didn't discount the physicians. Okay, that's that the myth of the scientific and religious conflict is a modern issue. So Judaism also has a tradition of healthcare. It's less formal. Within Greek and Roman communities, you see that there's a possible moral failure at the root of disease. Among the Hebrew, then Israelite, and then Jewish communities, you generally have healthcare taking place by the priests and the prophets. The priest would focus on the disease and the diseased body, whereas the prophet would often focus on the impact of the disease on the community. Okay, three important distinctions between Jewish healthcare, which will then in time become, once Christianity emerges from within Judaism, Christians will draw from this, are that while there will be possible moral failure at the root of the disease, for the Jews, the disease was more often, but still not always, punishment for disobedience of law. Okay, and this little piece is going to shift among Christians, which you've probably already clearly saw within the two readings that we had. Additionally, the prophet and the priest had direct access to that which is holy, and also had some degree of holiness themselves because they were in direct contact with the divine as a mediator. And then finally there was, and this is a really important piece that Christianity will adopt, is this emphasis on communal cohesion. So in other words, when I referenced Jesus earlier as a folk healer, right? And his role in folk healing was bringing individuals whose diseases made their families sick, right? Impacted their whole community, he worked in restoring those relations. Okay. It's so strange to me not to be able to say questions at this point, but I guess we'll get to that, right? So the last thing before we meet our authors is that irrespective of cult or irrespective of religion, there is almost always a hierarchy of disease. And the hierarchy of disease is that at the top, usually the divine figure is understood as causing or allowing the disease to exist because of human sin or human error. But there are always other factors in play. It's almost never the case that any author, theologian, ethicist, or philosopher is saying, this is only happening because that deity up there is angry at us because we did this one thing. They may write that, but there's always additional texts that support the fact that there's an understanding of other natural causes at work. So planet and star alignment, or bad water, you know, a corpse getting thrown in the well could, you know, you could wipe out a village, right? Or the weather would change, or the air would be bad. I mean, that's something we just experienced, you know, 2 weeks ago, right? Of how bad the air quality was, and that made some people sick. So, you know, that was quite possibly an opportunity where some people were saying, this is happening because X, Y, and Z in our life. And X, Y, and Z could have something to do with understandings of human sin, ecological sin, environmental sin, or it could have been, the idea could be divorced from that altogether, notion of sin altogether, okay? But either way, for anybody who is any kind of student of human behavior, which I'm assuming everyone who's here is, right? For any human student of human behavior, every single person is dealing with some level or degree of these factors, right? So the entire top component of this might be not even on the table, but there's still going to be some understanding of there are natural causes, right, that are creating this problem that we have, right? So keeping in mind that there is this hierarchy wherever a person may end up on it is very important, okay? So let's meet our authors and their context. So the first author, chronologically, is Cyprian of Carthage, and he lived from 200 to 258. And at the time he was born, you can see from the little star, that's Carthage, that's where he was the bishop. And during his lifetime, the empire shrank considerably, aided in part, I mean, the negative impact of the plague on the Roman Empire was the loss, incredible amount of territory. So a couple of details for you about this particular disease. It is thought that it began in Ethiopia, which at that time was still called Aksum, in the spring of about 250 CE, and then it arrived in Rome about a year later, and then eventually it spread to Greece and Syria. It was contagious. It was contagious not just person to person, but also through clothing. And so it was transmitted directly and indirectly. And the type of response to this hemorrhagic virus, with the diarrhea, with the bleeding, with the copious vomiting and the fevers and the quick death, has actually led some scholars quite recently to link it to an earliest example of Ebola that we have, because it's not plague the way, it doesn't present really itself as plague the way we understand plague. And we don't have DNA we don't have DNA from any of the that part of the empire for this disease. It lasted for about 20 years. So if you all are getting tired of this, we've got a ways to go, okay? It lasted 20 years at its height, killing nearly 5,000 people per day in Rome. And we have additional texts that confirm the historical components of both of these texts that I had you read for this assignment. During the time of this particular plague, the plague of Cyprian, there was drought, there was flood and famine, and anytime there's any kind of problematic weather changes, there's always problems with the market economy and always problems with food shortage and scarcity. 2 emperors died of the plague, and there was terrible fights amongst their rivals for the thrones. And there was incredible instability in the Roman government at this time. And there were so many deaths among the military that's part of the reason that the empire shrank in its territory so severely. And of course, economic and religious upheaval as a result. Now, the only group that really prospered because of this was the Christians. And by prospered, I don't mean economically. What I mean by that is that the response of Christianity, which was not a legal religion at that time, provided a theological rationale for suffering that was different. It was distinct from indigenous religions that the Greek and Roman views and from Judaism. They did not, Christian theologians of that time didn't say, this is happening because we've been really bad. Yes, there is some of that, but they twisted, right, the view of suffering as something to embrace and as an opportunity to demonstrate righteousness, okay? But they didn't just do that, okay? So in addition, they adopted this aspect of Jewish healthcare, which was concern for the community. And so they cared for the ill, they buried the dead, and all of this contributed to the growth of the religion because they looked really good. They looked really good during this time. Okay, our second author, John of Ephesus, who's writing in the 6th century, 400-year span, and between them, you're going to see the empire. John was born here in this part of modern-day Turkey, and he was the bishop, or excuse me, no, he was born in Syria, okay? And then he was the bishop here in Constantinople of this territory here, okay? So he spent time in both of those places. And you can see that the empire shrunk even more during what's known as the Justinianic plague, which lasted, you're going to love this, almost 200 years. So the plague of Justinian is called the plague of Justinian because he was the emperor at the time and he caught the plague, but he did not die. The point of origin for the Roman Empire was Egypt, but there are thoughts that it originated in either China or India and then spread to Egypt through the trade channels. And then it spread north to Alexandria and east to Palestine. So it spread primarily not just because of trade, but because of changes in the weather. So because there were global environmental catastrophes, the plague spread. So there was what's known as the Little Ice Age that changed the weather patterns during that time. There was weird things like snow during summer and all the crops were killed. And so as a result, rodents in the countryside that had nothing to eat moved to where people were and infected people. And then people got sick and people fled cities and fled to other cities and kept spreading the disease and spreading it and spreading it. So the cause of the plague is identified, bear with me as I try to pronounce this, Yersinia pestis, which is bubonic plague, so different from Cyprian's plague. But there's evidence that the bubonic plague, which has the boils, and the pneumonic, which is the pneumonia in the chest, and then septicemic, which is plague in the blood, which just to me sounds crazy. Right? Anyway, the initial outbreak, after the initial outbreak, it lasted for about 4 months quite intensely and then was reoccurring for 2 centuries with an overall population decline of about 50 million people. And because of the loss in population, this really reduced the Mediterranean in its importance and a great focus towards the rebuilding of aspects of the Roman Empire really started to look north. And so what we would today call the Low Countries and France or Gaul and Germany began to take on greater importance in terms of the reconstruction of the Roman Empire. So again, as I mentioned, really odd weather affected the crops, which of course resulted in food shortages and migration of highly infectious people and rats during a time when there's also warfare, because there's always warfare in the history of the Roman Empire. So what was the response of Christianity, which at that time was legal and official? Well, because it's legal and official, they got money, right? They're part of the institution of the government. And so as a result of having money for the care of people, bishops like John of Ephesus built and maintained huge hospital complexes in which they provided free care, food, alms, and clothing. They also conducted liturgies, prayer, ritual, and vigils. Now, this is the part that people usually say, well, why does any of that matter, right? Why does it matter that people are dying of plague and other people are praying? Well, we know, right, that there are mindfulness techniques, meditation, prayer, that help people, not just spiritually and mentally, but also physically, right? And so this is one of the gifts that early medieval Christianity provided. One really nice artistic example of this, see if my cursor will work. Here we have Pope Gregory the Great, who's leading a group around Rome during the plague. And this text right here is the Mary Queen of Heaven liturgy. And during his liturgy, it is reputed. Archangel Michael appeared at the top of one of the castles, and the plague, disappeared from the city. Now, historians don't say, okay, did that actually happen, right? We don't care, right? What we focus on is the fact that artistically and liturgically, this is a turning point for the health of people at that time, and that this event meant something at some level to people, enough that they would seek to record it in their liturgies, artistically, and write about it, okay? Except for this poor guy right here, he doesn't make it. Or maybe he does, I don't know, but it doesn't look like he's going. All right, so this takes us to our questions, and I know that either Tamara or Teresa is gonna help me in fielding some of the responses to this. I had 3 questions that I asked you, all 3 of which were linked to questions that, that the professors who organized this course, Professor Williams and Professor Chiabatti, asked us, the instructors of the distinct classes, to address. And so one that I chose was the ethical challenges posed by the pandemic. And so the question that I asked was based on Cyprian writing, and further, beloved brethren, it's all patriarchal language, by the way. It's all he's, all of these texts, all he all the time. So just know that, and don't, just know it. And further, beloved brethren, what is it? What a great thing is it? How pertinent, how necessary that pestilence and plague, which seems horrible and deadly, searches out the righteousness of each one. I love that. So the question is, his thesis is that an individual's unique response to pain and suffering, disease and death is a test of faithfulness to one's ideology and an indication of one's character. And this is an example of how these events have shaped his theological views and social activity. Choosing one of his biblical examples, or an example of your own, describe the limits and possibilities of this thesis, those inside or outside of faith traditions as you've witnessed them in our current pandemic climate, and explain how, and I can't read the rest of that sentence because it says that I'm screen sharing, theological views and social activity. So at this point, I'm going to stop talking. And I understand that I will be.
Hi, Brenda. Teresa here.
Hi.
So we can invite participants to share some ideas in the chat window of responses to this question. So how you've seen some of these these tensions playing out in the current pandemic.
And I can't see any of the chats. So I'm just relying on you.
Okay. It'll probably take folks a little while to type in their responses.
And that's fine. And I have no clock, so I actually have no idea what time it is. How are we doing for time?
It is 6:45.
Okay, that's not good.
We'll make it work. It's all good.
We'll give it another 35 seconds to a minute to see. It's a lot to formulate in a chat, or if you have any questions related to this question that Dr. Llewellyn-Eisen has asked, that would be great. If not, we can move to your next question.
Sure. And these might be questions that people want to reflect on in their papers, right? It's not that you have to all be, you had the opportunity to read these questions in advance, and that's fine. If you formulated things, that's great. But you may think, this is too much for me to put into a chat window, or I need to rest with this question because she's asked too damn much of me right now. And that's okay. Sometimes it's too much.
Oh, we have a question. So Brenda, I'm just going to read it directly from the chat. This is from Lainey. I hope I'm pronouncing your name correctly. I actually have a question. Do you know if there has been a spike in religion during COVID-19 like there have been observed in the past?
That's a really great question that shows some of my own limitations, because I deal I deal with the history of religion really up to about Martin Luther. But we can't really, avoid, I mean, I read the news copiously, so of course I pay attention to these things too. There's been an interesting argument about religion with respect to COVID-19, which I have been paying attention to. So while I cannot answer in such a way that says that I know that there's been a spike in religion, there has been a spike about religious activity, and it's been pretty extensive. People do not like being told to stay home and not go to worship. And some worship communities have dealt with this better than others. I know of one religious community that has their parishioners make reservations for attending service, which I think is hilarious and clever. But they're also Orthodox, so they have services 7 days a week. So, I mean, you're not really gonna miss out too much. But the biggest issue has been, one of the key liturgies of Christian communities is, of course, what's known as Holy Communion. And Holy Communion involves eating and drinking. And so this has been problematic for a lot of Christians who are struggling with the fact that they can't connect with their community. They can't take a ritual that matters to them and gives them meaning in their life, because if their life is organized around that ritual, and to suddenly not have that ritual, I've seen more conversation about that than I have about people are now becoming more religious. So that's the best that I can answer that question.
Great, thank you, Brenda.
Yeah.
So someone made a comment that the pandemic has given communities opportunities to support each other, help each other, and take care of each other.
Yes, in different ways than we have before. Yes. Yeah. It's been especially hard for I'm not going to say that it's harder for one group of people than another, but it has certainly been hard for the elderly, I think, in ways that we can't necessarily appreciate, because we've got great technology here. I'm talking to 100 people right now that I can't really see. And that's amazing. But there are, like, I think of my mother, who calls me on a rotary phone that I have on my counter that I pay for a monthly fee so that she can call me on a rotary phone, because that's what makes sense for her. So it's harder, I know, for people of a certain age. And so, yeah, they've had to learn how to support each other in different ways. So I would like to just quickly point out the last two questions that we have. And I think at least one of them is answerable in ways that are exciting. The second question has to do with John of Ephesus's, that's a really hard name for someone with a lisp, story of the plague from his ecclesiastical history. This deals with the intersection of the pandemic with social and economic inequalities. So along with vivid descriptions of the physical toll that the plague took on the city, along with terrifying images, John emphasized accounts of those who tried to profit off the plague. This is one example of how a public health crisis can introduce specific economic and social injustices in Syria at that time. Why would this crime of looting the gold and silver of the dead be heinous? If the dead are dead, does it matter? And then I want to just go quickly to the third question, which we might have, I'm hoping, some comments on, which is about the role of the arts throughout the pandemic globally. Because all of you people out there that I can't see, there are going to be some weeks where this class is discussing especially that. And so this is sort of like pointing forward to you. John writes, and for whom would he who wrote be writing? And it takes everything to not cry when I read that line. To me, that is one of the most poignant lines in my field. And for whom would he who wrote be writing? It shows his despair. I'm writing this. I know it's possible. No one will be alive to read it. And yet he produces something. And so there's this, you know, we don't tend to think of writing theology as artistic or as creative, but it absolutely is. And so this is my question. Why do these men write? How might documenting the public and graphic effects of their society's disease assist them internally as they are situated as leaders during a traumatic moment? So I'm wondering if anybody is seeing artistic commitment happening now, if anyone wants to share.
As we wait for some of those responses to come into the chat, we had a question earlier about whether there have currently been any private priests like there were during the Black Death. And if you're familiar with that phrase, maybe you can explain what that is for the rest of us.
Yeah, well, the Black Death is usually referring to the pandemic or the plague of the High Middle Ages. And the term Black is often it's often thought to refer to the kind of bruising and of septicemic plague, but it actually comes from it using the word to describe the horror, right? The blackness, the despair of the plague. So the Black Plague. So that lasted over 100 years and wiped out millions of people in Europe. And so, you know, I've seen actually the opposite in this case, not where you have private priesthood, but where you have, and this is where you have evangelical and Protestant pastors who are saying, we don't need to be isolating, right? And dealing with each other in a one-on-one kind of way, but we need to be, you know, ignoring, or not ignoring, but not viewing the rule of social distancing as applying to us because God will protect us. Kind of see more of the opposite.
Yeah. And we have a couple of comments here, and I'll read two of these. So Peyton says, I feel like so many people I know have been doing introspective work while stuck at home. And by doing that have had epiphanies about their lives, their spirituality, and how they think about themselves. So in that way, we've seen people searching out righteousness on their own.
Oh, that's great. Oh, I love it. Peyton, good on you. Is that Peyton? Did I say the name right? Did I hear that correctly? Done. Yeah. And accurate. I think it's just spot on accurate. You know, we're stuck. We have to go inward.
And then a couple of responses related specifically to the question about creative responses. So Michelle says, I see artistic commitment in the humorous parody videos that folks are publishing on YouTube. And another participant says, absolutely seeing lots of artistic endeavors, especially music and humor.
Yep.
With people stuck at home, there's more demand for entertainment and the arts. Songs have been adapted to reflect on the time.
Yeah, there's a great song by Todrick Hall where he's actually parodying his own music video. It's brilliant. It's brilliant. It's fun, and many people got involved in making that. I'll put a link up on my little September 30th page.
Great. And another comment that I feel like so many artists who are socially aware with their work have been releasing things about the Black Lives Matter movement and the toll that isolation has been taking on them.
Yep, exactly. I wonder how that will be sustained, right? This is what, right? As we are now in, you know, like month 6 of this, becoming our norm. I'm just wondering, will we continue to hold that as important to do, important work to do.
And there's a final question, probably because we're reaching the 7 o'clock time. It says, Sarah is, I think, and Theo together are trying to answer the question about the second question related to the riches that needed to be abandoned or not.
Mhm.
And it reads, the response is, I know that there are belief systems that believe it is important to bury people with their belongings, but I don't personally follow those belief systems. And I
Yeah.
think that the wealth of the dead person should go to the people that need them. So it raises the question of who do the riches belong to in the
Yeah.
temple that the boy is sitting out in front of?
Yeah.
And, you know, I think if you could respond to that commentary, it would be great.
Yeah, there are a couple of different ways in which Christian theologians specifically have addressed the role of wealth. Among the Jews, you know, from whom Christianity will emerge, God created everything, so everything was God's. It's not the case that when you give to Caesar what is Caesar and give to God's what is God's, Caesar's is nothing. It's all God's, right? So what I hear, was it one or two people were writing this together? I'm misunderstood.
Sarah and Theo.
Okay. What I'm hearing in the question is an interesting self-reflection on, I don't view this way, but here's how I'm understanding this particular religious tradition, right? As understanding it. Did I get that correct?
You're the expert, so I will defer to you. But there was
No,
another
I mean on the question, could you perhaps
Yeah.
read the question?
Well, I think I think your understanding of it is accurate. I know that there are belief systems that believe it is important to bury people with their belongings, but I don't personally follow these beliefs.
Right.
And I think that the wealth of dead people should go to people that need them.
Right. So that's going to conflict with how the family or the dead viewed their wealth during their lifetime, right? Because we might say, oh, well, they're dead, so it doesn't matter. But if the religious system understands that wealth as belonging to them, then it needs to go with them, right? And so this is often a conflict of like, well, who's left alive? Right? Who's left alive and where is the need? And so this actually then becomes an ethical question in sort of determining, like, is it the religious view that takes precedence over the current public need, right? I know what John would say, but that's not necessarily, you know, what we would agree with. If you'd like, I can go through quickly here to my concluding thoughts, which I'm not gonna read through, but just irrespective of one's personal view of the value of any given religious group, there is of course a historic importance to religious responses and the opportunities that are gained or lost in pivotal moments when we deal with a public health crisis. And that can be found in creativity. And I consider creativity as including, you know, the development of medicine as much as the development of art, as much as theological and philosophical reflections on these things. So to me, I don't necessarily draw lines between them, which the chair of interdisciplinary studies here probably likes. But then also in terms of spirituality, it's important to engage on reflection on life, on death, and hierarchy of cause, and to consider things like how we can support people who are approaching these medically pivotal moments, and how we can support people whose lives are shaped by death, or how we can support people who actually survive the death of those who are close to them. And so religious responses to these kinds of public health crises are worth keeping in mind. And there's my.
Great. Well, thank you, Professor. This was so interesting. I loved hearing about kind of the historical and religious context for plagues, and it really provides some nice insight to what we are going through today. So thank you very much.
The historic similarities are alarming. And I don't believe that, you know, those who don't know history are condemned to repeat it, because we're just always going to repeat it anyway, right? Whether we know it or not.
Yeah.
But it is alarming to me to see these different points of time and see the tragic mistakes that keep resulting in these kinds of events.
Mm-hmm.
So I will mute myself now.
Yeah. A few months ago, I read The Great Influenza because I felt like I just kind of wanted to understand a little bit more about the 1918 flu and how it was similar and different to today. And I had a similar reaction. Like there's actually something comforting in a way to see that some of the same mistakes were being made. It sort of felt like, okay, well, this is just what happens when there's a pandemic, and we'll get through it like they did then.
Yeah, we will. Yeah, we will.
Yeah.
I find it so, I really enjoyed your talk, Brenda. Thank you so much. And what I find interesting also is the connection with the talk last week, where we welcomed a couple of PLU alums that are in emergency medicine. And one of them, Dr. Brian Bierbauer, kept on coming back to the theme of how important it is. It's just as important to support patients in healing them as it is to help them transition to death. And I found that was a really interesting connection with what to your concluding remarks, right? That's still a field that we know is getting more and more attention through hospice care and such. But I think the fact that you're working with a text from eons ago that still points to that need says something about how taboo the subject still is across many disciplines and fields. So thank you so much for that. And we're up against our time now. So we just want to remind everybody about next week's talk, which will be a foray into another culture's exploration and expression of the origins and consequences of a plague. This time by Dr. Carmina Palerm, a member of PLU's Hispanic Studies program, as well as an affiliate faculty of PLU's Native American and Indigenous Studies program. She'll explore the topic of plagues in a creation story in the Popol Vuh, which is a text of Quiché origin. This is one of the groups of the Maya peoples from southern Mexico and Central America. And the talk by Dr. Palerm is titled, "What Can the Quiché Creation Stories Teach Us About How to Live with the Existence of Plagues and Disease?" So Brenda, thank you so much. And we look forward to seeing you all next week, same time. Thank you very much. Good evening.
Thanks, everyone. Good night.